Chosen one, before you decided to stay with this message, there may have been a moment when your thumb almost kept scrolling. Maybe the last few days have felt strangely familiar, as though the same questions keep returning no matter how busy you've tried to become. Or perhaps you've been waking with a quiet weight you couldn't explain, carrying the feeling that something inside you has been trying to get your attention long before you found these words. Out of every voice competing for your attention today, you are here. I don't believe that happened without purpose. And deep down, I think part of you already knows that too. Long before this moment arrived, God had already been watching over your path with a patience far greater than you can see. Sometimes recognition comes softly before it ever arrives with certainty. These next 3 days carry a significance that many people around you may never recognize. July 1st, July 2nd, and July 3rd are more than dates on a calendar. They stand like a threshold between what the first half of your journey has been preparing and what God is now inviting you to receive. If something inside you felt pulled toward this message instead of 100 others, don't rush past that feeling. Your spirit often recognizes an invitation before your mind has words for it. Whether you arrived at the very beginning of this window, somewhere in its quiet middle, or during what feels like its final hours, the invitation remains the same. God's timing is generous toward the chosen one. His hand does not withdraw simply because you arrived with questions instead of certainty. The door is still open, and the quiet invitation is still reaching toward you. Throughout Scripture, God often moved through the rhythm of 3 days before breakthrough appeared. 3 days of waiting before impossible doors opened. 3 days before hope rose where loss once seemed final. Again and again, those moments marked the crossing from one season into another, and perhaps that is why these 3 days deserve your attention with an open heart. This is not a message meant to fill you with fear or convince you that God is waiting to punish hesitation. The deeper invitation is much quieter than that. Every season carries opportunities that eventually pass, and sometimes the greatest loss is simply continuing to live beneath the fullness of what God has patiently been preparing within you. That quiet ache you've carried for so long deserves to be listened to instead of explained away. You have probably felt it before. There were moments when you looked at your own life and wondered why it never seemed to reflect what you sensed deep inside yourself. Maybe you've even questioned whether you imagined that longing, whether your expectations were simply too high, or whether you were asking for something that was never meant for you. Stay with that feeling for just a moment, because it may be more honest than you've allowed yourself to believe. The chosen one is never defined by a title or by personal ambition. The chosen one is shaped through seasons that very few people understand, through waiting, refining, disappointment, quiet rebuilding, and countless moments when it seemed as though nothing was changing. What God prepares always carries the marks of endurance before it carries the weight of purpose. Yet there is something many chosen ones spend years misunderstanding. Being chosen does not automatically mean living in the fullness of everything God has placed within you. Many people carry extraordinary purpose while only expressing a small portion of who they were created to become, and that gap often creates a sadness that words struggle to describe. Think about driving through dense morning fog. The road never disappears, and neither does the destination. Yet every step forward feels slower because you cannot see very far ahead. Many chosen ones have lived in that kind of spiritual fog for so long that they have begun to believe uncertainty is simply how life will always feel. They stopped expecting clarity because waiting became more familiar than seeing. Perhaps this is why these 3 days, July 1st, July 2nd, and July 3rd, carry such quiet significance. God is not asking you to become someone different or to exhaust yourself trying harder. He is inviting you to receive what has always belonged to you, something prepared long before your first breath, long before anyone spoke your name. You were chosen before you were formed. Let that settle for a moment. That is more than an encouraging thought. It is a reminder that God's intention for your life existed before the opinions that told you that you were too much, and before the voices that later convinced you that you were somehow not enough. Year after year, the world teaches people to shrink what makes them different until they forget what they once carried naturally. Many of those voices never intended to wound you. Some came from people who loved you but could only understand life through the limits of their own experience. Others came from systems that rewarded blending in more than becoming who God created you to be. Little by little, those messages settled into places inside you, until what once felt alive became quiet. Before we go any further, stay with this next thought, because it changes how this entire message is understood. These 3 days are not simply another spiritual idea to admire from a distance. They may become one of those moments you remember years from now. The kind of quiet turning point that only makes complete sense when you look back and realize a door had been standing open all along. This window was never meant for everyone in the same way. It speaks to the chosen one who has spent years carrying an inner knowing while wondering whether it was real. It speaks to the person who kept trying to fit into places where every attempt to belong slowly cost them their peace. It speaks to the one who has been waiting for permission to believe that the longing inside them was never meaningless. Across generations, people of deep faith understood that seasons of focused preparation often changed something within the heart before they changed anything around them. Again and again, 3 days became a rhythm of surrender, expectation, and renewed openness before breakthrough arrived. Scripture reflects that pattern in remarkable ways, reminding us that preparation often comes quietly before transformation becomes visible. If something in this message has reached a place inside you that has been waiting to be recognized, type "chosen" in the comments. If your heart has quietly carried the hope that a season like this would one day arrive, and something within you recognizes this invitation, type "chosen." Sometimes the smallest response becomes a simple way of saying, "I'm ready to pay attention." These 3 days are more than symbolism. They invite your heart into deeper readiness, where waiting begins to give way to expectation and hidden preparation starts revealing its purpose. Throughout Scripture, the 3rd day often became the moment when what had been unfolding beneath the surface finally emerged into the light. And perhaps that is why your spirit feels this moment so deeply. You are here for more than a video. You are here in this season, in this moment, at this particular point in your own journey. Whether you fully understand why today, or only recognize it much later, there is a quiet sense that something long prepared is beginning to meet the life you are living now. The world around you is changing faster than many people know how to process. Things that once felt permanent suddenly seem uncertain. Familiar foundations are beginning to shift, and what once appeared predictable no longer carries the same sense of security. While many see only disruption, the chosen one often senses that every shaking season is making room for something that could never emerge while everything stayed the same. Right in the middle of that change, God continues to look for hearts that remain open and willing to respond. You have been preparing for this season far longer than you probably realize. Every disappointment that stretched your faith, every delay that quietly strengthened your character, every loss that stripped away what was never meant to stay, has been shaping you for moments like this. Looking back one day, you may realize that nothing was wasted, because every chapter carried you toward this threshold. The grace connected to these 3 days is being offered freely, yet every invitation still asks for a response. July does not become meaningful simply because it appears on a calendar. It becomes meaningful when the chosen one decides to step through the door while it is standing open. Sometimes the greatest moments of change begin with a quiet decision that almost no one else can see. There is something important you need to understand about this window. It is not meant to frighten you into action, and it is not built around the fear of punishment. The deeper warning is much more personal than that. Every season carries opportunities that cannot simply be recreated whenever we feel more comfortable, because each moment arrives with its own unique grace. In every season there seem to be 2 kinds of chosen ones. There are those who recognize the invitation even while they still have questions, and they move forward with open hands. Then there are those who sincerely believe the invitation is real, yet keep waiting for life to become easier before they respond. They never lose God's love, but they often discover later that the moment itself quietly passed while they were waiting for certainty. Life continues either way. The days still move forward, responsibilities remain, and the world keeps turning. Yet there is a quiet difference between simply existing and living in the fullness of what God has been preparing within you. Many chosen ones only recognize that difference years later, when they look back and remember the season that invited them to take one faithful step. How many times have you felt something stirring deep inside your heart, only to tell yourself that you would return to it when life became less complicated? How many prayers ended with, "maybe later," because you hoped the timing would eventually feel easier? If those questions feel familiar, you are far from alone. Most of us have searched for a version of readiness that never fully arrives. The truth is that hesitation often speaks with a gentle voice. It tells you there will always be another opportunity, another season, another moment when everything finally feels settled. Yet life rarely becomes as quiet as we imagine it will. And the invitation God places before us is usually meant to be answered in the season where it first appears. That is why this message carries a sense of urgency without carrying condemnation. Ignoring this window does not separate you from God's love. It simply means continuing to carry possibilities that were ready to become realities. Doors do not always disappear, but there are seasons when opening them requires far less struggle, because your heart has been prepared to walk through them. If you have been sitting in silence, wondering whether you somehow missed your chance, hear this with an open heart. Your silence is not proof that you have failed. It is not evidence that God has forgotten you, and it is not confirmation that your story has already reached its ending. Sometimes silence is simply the place where hidden preparation finishes its work before clarity finally arrives. The distance between where you are today and the life God has placed before you may feel overwhelming at times, yet it is far closer than fear would have you believe. You do not have to become someone entirely different before you can move forward. Often the next step begins when you stop carrying expectations that were never yours to bear and begin trusting the quiet work God has already been doing within you. Many chosen ones have spent years believing they became smaller because they lacked faith, when in reality they simply learned to live beneath the weight of other people's expectations. Little by little they stopped speaking with boldness, stopped trusting the sensitivity God had given them, and slowly accepted a version of themselves that felt easier for the world to understand. That shrinking rarely happens in a single moment. It happens one quiet compromise at a time. Perhaps you have felt that too. Maybe there were rooms where you learned to hide your compassion because it was called weakness. Maybe you stopped sharing what God placed on your heart because it seemed easier than being misunderstood. Eventually, what once felt alive begins to feel like a distant memory, and you start wondering whether that version of yourself ever truly existed. But what God placed within you has never disappeared. Like a seed resting beneath winter soil, it has remained whole even while unseen. The season of waiting has never been the end of your story. It has been protecting something that was never meant to bloom before its appointed time. That is why these 3 days in July matter. They invite you to stop treating your deepest calling as though it belongs to some distant version of yourself. The person God has been patiently shaping is closer than you think, and perhaps this is the season where waiting begins to give way to becoming. If you are ready to stop settling for a smaller version of the life God has been inviting you into, type "awaken" in the comments. And if something inside you recognizes that this season feels different from the ones before it, type "awaken" as your own quiet declaration that your heart is open to receive what God has been preparing all along. Some people describe the beginning of that change with surprisingly simple words. They do not speak about dramatic moments or instant answers. Instead, they describe a quiet shift, as though prayer no longer feels like reaching across an impossible distance, but like discovering that God's presence had been closer than they ever realized. As that quiet shift begins within you, the first changes are often so gentle that you could almost overlook them. The prayers you have carried for years begin to feel different, not because God suddenly became closer, but because your heart starts recognizing the nearness that was always there. What once felt like reaching across a great distance slowly becomes resting in a relationship that has been patiently waiting for you to notice it. The same is true for many chosen ones who spent years believing that the very qualities which made them feel different were burdens they had to hide. Some learned to silence their sensitivity because they feared it made them difficult to understand. Others spent so much energy trying to fit into rooms they had outgrown that they almost forgot the quiet strength God had placed within them from the beginning. Then, almost unexpectedly, those same qualities begin to take on a different meaning. The compassion that once felt overwhelming becomes wisdom. The sensitivity that once felt heavy becomes discernment. The quiet inner knowing you questioned for so many years begins to guide you with a confidence that cannot be manufactured through effort alone. That is how many chosen ones discover that God was never asking them to become someone new. He was gently restoring what had been covered over by fear, disappointment, and years of trying to become acceptable to a world that could not recognize what it had never been given to carry. Sometimes restoration feels less like becoming someone else, and more like finally recognizing the person God always saw. Perhaps that is why this season feels different. It is not because everything around you changes overnight. It is because something within you begins to settle into truth. You stop measuring your life by what has not happened yet, and begin noticing how faithfully God has been preparing you through every season you once called a delay. There are moments when transformation announces itself with unmistakable clarity. More often, it arrives quietly, like the first light before sunrise. You suddenly realize that peace comes more easily, that fear no longer speaks with the same authority, and that hope has begun returning without you forcing it to appear. The chosen one rarely recognizes the full weight of preparation while living through it. Looking back, the difficult seasons begin to form a pattern that was impossible to see in the moment. Every unanswered question, every closed door, every unexpected detour was slowly shaping a heart capable of carrying what God had already prepared. That is why these 3 days in July deserve your full attention. They are an invitation to stop believing that your deepest calling belongs only to some future version of yourself. The life God has been leading you toward has been drawing closer with every faithful step, even during the seasons when nothing seemed to be changing. If your heart has been quietly waiting for permission to believe that again, receive this moment with open hands. You do not have to force what God is already unfolding. You simply have to remain available to the work He has been doing in you long before you had words to describe it. And this is where these 3 days in July begin to carry a deeper meaning. They are more than an interesting point on the calendar, and they are more than a moment meant to inspire you before life returns to normal. There are seasons when the heart becomes unusually open to what God has been preparing all along, and this feels like one of those seasons. Sometimes the longest periods of waiting quietly prepare us for the shortest moments of decision. Throughout Scripture and throughout the lives of those who have walked closely with God, there is a pattern that appears again and again. Seasons of prayer, surrender, and patient expectation often came before moments that changed everything. It was never about the number itself. It was about what happened inside a person who remained faithful long enough for their heart to become ready to receive what heaven had been preparing. Perhaps that is why these 3 days matter so deeply, not because they carry magic, but because they invite you to pause long enough to hear what constant noise has almost caused you to forget. The chosen one often spends years asking God to move, only to discover that God has been quietly preparing them to receive what they have been praying for. Whether you found this message at the very beginning of these 3 days, somewhere in the middle, or as the window begins to close, you are still here. The invitation has not passed you by. There is still time to respond with an open heart, and sometimes that simple willingness becomes the beginning of everything that follows. If something inside you recognizes a truth you have carried for years without fully knowing how to describe it, take a moment and like this message. If these words remind you of a longing that has quietly followed you through season after season, let that simple response become your way of saying, "I'm listening." The changes God begins within us are rarely loud at first. More often they arrive with a quiet clarity that slowly replaces confusion. Thoughts that once felt tangled begin to settle. Prayer becomes less like searching for someone far away and more like resting in the presence that has faithfully remained beside you through every season. Many chosen ones describe that season with surprising simplicity. Nothing around them changed overnight, yet everything within them began to feel different. They found themselves carrying more peace than fear, more confidence than striving, and a deeper trust that God was already moving in places they could not yet see. When your heart begins to rest, instead of constantly reaching, you start noticing what has been there all along. Hope no longer feels fragile. Discernment becomes quieter but stronger. The voice of fear slowly loses the authority it once seemed to hold over every decision you made. God did not bring you to this moment simply so you could admire the possibility of change from a distance. He brought you here because invitations are meant to be received. These 3 days are an opportunity to open your hands instead of tightening your grip, to stop waiting for perfect certainty and begin responding to the quiet confidence growing within your spirit. Before you move any further, there is something you need to hear that remains true regardless of how quickly you feel your circumstances change. This message has never been about earning God's attention. It has always been about remembering what He has been saying over your life since before you knew how to listen. You were never created to live as a smaller version of the person God formed you to become. The gifts He placed within you were intentional, and the experiences that shaped you were never random. There is a unique expression of His purpose that only your life can carry. And the world does not lose its need for that, simply because you have questioned your own ability to fulfill it. This is why the chosen one carries both privilege and responsibility. Being chosen was never meant to make you feel spiritually superior. It was always meant to prepare you to serve, to love faithfully, and to bring hope into places where hope has become difficult to find. God is not asking you to exhaust yourself by trying harder than you already have. He is inviting you into something far more peaceful than constant striving. He is asking you to trust what He has been cultivating within you through every hidden season, every unanswered prayer, and every quiet act of obedience that no one else ever noticed. For too long you have tried to carry something extraordinary while believing you had to become smaller in order to be accepted. You learned to question your own sensitivity, your compassion, your convictions, and even the dreams God quietly placed inside your heart. Yet none of those gifts disappeared. They simply waited beneath the surface, protected until the season arrived when they could finally grow without apology. That season may be closer than you think. The weight you have carried is not proof that you lacked faith, and it is not evidence that God stepped away from you. It is simply the reminder that the chosen one often grows in hidden places long before the world ever recognizes the fruit. What God has been preparing within you has never been lost, and it has never stopped moving toward the moment when it would finally be revealed. There is something I believe God wants to place gently into your hands right now. And perhaps it is something your heart has needed for a very long time. I want to give you permission to lay down the quiet story you have been telling yourself. The one that says the distance between where you are today and where God is leading you somehow proved you have failed. That story has carried enough weight, and it no longer deserves to shape the way you see yourself. The truth is far more hopeful than that. The very ache you carry may be one of the clearest signs that your calling is real. You cannot long for a destination that was never meant for you, and you cannot grieve the distance unless somewhere deep within your spirit you have already heard God whisper that there is more ahead. That longing is not your enemy. It is often the quiet evidence that heaven has already planted purpose inside your heart. There are people who move through life without ever feeling but holy restlessness. They become comfortable where they are, because nothing within them keeps calling them higher. But the chosen one knows a different kind of ache. It is the gentle tension between what has already been placed inside you and what is still waiting to be revealed, and that tension has never been meant to discourage you. It has always been inviting you to keep walking, so receive this as more than encouragement. Receive it as something your soul has been waiting to remember. You were chosen before you were formed, And that truth did not begin the day you discovered it. It has existed since before your first breath, long before the world spoke its opinions over your life, and long before fear convinced you to question what God had already settled. Let these words become your own as you listen. God has not changed his mind about me. The distance between where I stand today and where he is leading me is not proof of failure. It is the path that leads toward the inheritance he has been preparing for me. During these 3 days in July, I choose to open my hands to what God has already been making ready in his perfect time. You do not have to earn what has always been held for you in love. This is not about reaching for a new identity as though God forgot to give you one. It is about allowing the life he has already spoken over you to become more visible, more complete, and more fully expressed in the way you live each day. Restoration always begins by remembering what has been true all along. The invitation these 3 days carry is beautifully simple, even if responding to it takes courage. God is asking for your willingness more than your perfection. One honest step taken in faith can change the direction of everything that follows, because obedience often begins long before certainty ever arrives. You do not need every answer before you move. You do not need fear to disappear before you trust God with what comes next. If perfect confidence had been the requirement for every person God called throughout Scripture, many of those stories would never have been written. What God has always welcomed is a heart that remains available, even while it is still learning to trust. That is why this moment matters, not because every circumstance will suddenly change overnight, but because something inside you can begin changing today. The peace you have been searching for often arrives before the breakthrough you have been praying for, and that quiet peace becomes the strength that carries you through whatever comes next. God has attached a promise to this season, and it reaches much deeper than immediate results. The promise is that what has felt hidden will begin to find its voice. What has seemed dimmed by disappointment will begin to shine again. The gifts he placed within you have never disappeared. They have simply been waiting for the season where they could finally grow without being overshadowed by fear. When these 3 days have passed, the greatest change may not be something everyone else immediately notices. It may be the quiet confidence that settles inside you, the peace that no longer depends on circumstances, and the growing awareness that you no longer have to force what God has been patiently cultivating all along. The person he created you to become has been closer than you imagined. This is the promise held before every chosen one who responds to God's invitation with an open heart. Heaven has never watched your life with disappointment. From the very beginning, God has been patiently weaving together every victory, every wound, every unanswered question, and every unexpected delay into a story that carries purpose far beyond what you could see while living through it. You have been preparing for this season much longer than you realize. Every difficult chapter strengthened something within you. Every closed door redirected you. Every season that felt painfully slow was quietly building the kind of character that could faithfully carry what God already knew he would one day entrust to you. So hear this with confidence. You are not behind God's timing for your life. You are standing exactly where his preparation has led you. And these 3 days in July may become the place where years of hidden growth finally begin meeting visible purpose. The grace of this moment is not standing at a distance, waiting to see what you will do. It is reaching toward every chosen one who is willing to receive it. And perhaps there is one more reason you are still listening. Through every part of this message, something inside you has remained present, because these words have touched places you rarely speak about out loud. That is not something to dismiss. Sometimes the deepest confirmations arrive quietly, long before they can be fully explained. Carry this with you long after this message ends. You were chosen before you were formed. The distance between the life you are living today and the life God has prepared for you has never been the measure of your failure. It is simply the remaining path between preparation and fulfillment, and by God's grace that path is already unfolding before you. And in these 3 days, July 1st, July 2nd, and July 3rd, The path between where you have been and where God is leading you has rarely felt this close. This is not simply another date that will quietly pass on the calendar before life moves on as usual. It is an invitation to pause long enough to recognize what God has been patiently weaving together through every season that came before this one. Even the chapters that felt confusing, delayed, or painfully ordinary have been preparing your heart in ways you could not fully see while you were living them. Sometimes an entire future begins with one quiet decision that hardly anyone else notices. Yet heaven recognizes it as the moment everything started to change. Before you move on with your day, think about the people God has quietly placed along your path. Share this message with someone who has been carrying the same silent questions you once carried. Someone who has wondered whether the longing inside them has any purpose at all. Think of the chosen one in your life who has almost convinced themselves that they were expecting too much from God, when in reality they simply grew tired of waiting. They may not have the language to describe what they have been feeling, but perhaps these words will become the confirmation they have been asking for in prayer without even realizing it. Don't allow these 3 days to pass without giving someone else the opportunity to receive the same encouragement that found you. Sometimes the greatest act of faith is not standing on a stage or accomplishing something extraordinary. Sometimes it is quietly extending hope to another person who has almost stopped believing that hope still belongs to them. You never truly know how close someone is to giving up, or how deeply they have been asking God for a sign that He still sees them. What strengthened your heart today may become the very answer another heart has been waiting to hear. Respond to what God is stirring within you during this season with openness rather than pressure. You do not have to force what comes next, manufacture an emotional experience, or convince yourself that everything suddenly makes sense. Simply remain attentive. Stay available. Let your heart become still enough to recognize the quiet ways God often speaks. The smallest step of trust frequently carries more eternal weight than years spent waiting for a version of certainty that was never meant to arrive before obedience. As these days unfold, pay close attention to the quiet places within your own heart. Transformation rarely announces itself with noise or dramatic moments that everyone around you can see. More often it arrives the way dawn enters a dark room, slowly and almost unnoticed, until one morning you realize the shadows no longer carry the same authority they once did. That is how many of God's deepest works begin, not by changing everything around you at once, but by gently changing the way you see Him, the way you see yourself, and the way you walk through each new day. You may find yourself responding to situations with a peace that surprises you. You may notice that fear no longer has the final word in every decision, or that the questions which once kept you awake through the night begin losing their grip on your heart. Those quiet changes are easy to overlook because they happen so naturally, yet they often become the strongest evidence that God has been working beneath the surface long before anything visible began to change. When you look back on July 1st, July 2nd, and July 3rd, I hope you will remember them as far more than dates on a calendar. Remember them as the season when you stopped measuring yourself by fear and began trusting what God had been cultivating beneath the surface all along. Remember them as the place where striving slowly gave way to surrender, where waiting gradually became expectation, and where the future no longer felt like something you had to force into existence. Years from now, you may discover that these were the days when your heart quietly turned toward the life God had been preparing for you from the very beginning. If this message has spoken to something your heart has carried in silence, leave the number 3 in the comments below. Let it become your quiet declaration that you recognize this season and that you are choosing to walk forward with faith instead of hesitation. Even a simple act of agreement can become a meaningful reminder of the decision your heart made today, and your response may encourage another chosen one who needed to know they are not walking this path alone. And to the chosen one who almost kept scrolling, the one who stayed while another part of you kept searching for reasons why these words could not possibly be meant for you, the one who wondered whether this was simply another message that would fade as quickly as it appeared. I want you to hear this before we part, because perhaps this is the sentence your heart has been waiting for more than anything else. God sees you. He sees the prayers you never spoke out loud because you were afraid they would never be answered. He sees the disappointments you quietly carried so that no one else would know how deeply they affected you. He sees the nights when you questioned yourself, the mornings when you kept going despite feeling empty, and the quiet courage it has taken simply to keep believing through seasons that made very little sense. Every tear you chose not to explain, every act of faith no one applauded, every moment you continued trusting when nothing around you seemed to confirm your hope. None of it has escaped his attention. The fact that you are still here, still listening, still holding on, is not something to dismiss lightly. Perhaps that is because this message found you at exactly the moment your heart was ready to receive it. Maybe you cannot explain why you stayed until the end, yet something inside you knew there was one more word you needed to hear. You are here because something deeper than coincidence has been gently leading you, and the invitation is still open. These 3 days in July are not asking you to become someone different or earn a place that God has already prepared. They are inviting you to step more fully into the person He has been patiently forming through every hidden season, every unanswered prayer, every delay, and every quiet victory that no one else ever saw. You were chosen before you were formed, and this is the season where what has been hidden begins to find expression. Go forward with confidence. Chosen one, not because every question has been answered, but because the one who called you has remained faithful through every season that brought you here. Walk toward the inheritance God has been preparing for you, with open hands, a willing heart, and quiet confidence that His timing has never been working against you. The invitation has been waiting for you, and perhaps today is the moment you finally recognize that it has carried your name from the very beginning.